Hello, folks. Welcome back. Episode 66. And we have, he needs no introduction, but in case you haven't heard, which I doubt because he's all over the place, and we were just talking about that before we started the show, I have guest Gary Wayne, author of the Genesis 6 Conspiracy, on how secret societies and the descendants of giants plan to enslave humankind, details the role of the modern-day Nephilim in Satan's plan to install the Antichrist at the end of days. That's from his book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy. Welcome back to the show, Gary Wayne. How you doing, buddy?
Doing very well, and so happy to be back working with you and looking forward to the conversation today. So, yeah, nice to be back and staying busy, but certainly looking forward to discussing a few things with you guys today. That's
great. I mean, I think you broke the record. I think you've been on the show the most. I think you and Mike Davis, wow. One of our other authors and scholars we have on our show, yep. And so appreciate your time.
Well, always try and make as much time as I can. It's really important, I think, particularly what's going on today, is to get information out there so that people can sort of better understand where we are and why we're at where we're at, and perhaps some indication as to what might be coming. So I think it's important to stay out there and stay in contact with as many people as we can.
Yeah, and I believe the information is important. And so for the people that might not know, and, because I know I get, weekly new listeners here and there. And so, we've had you on, and the first time we had you on, we talked about what giants are, the Nephilim are in the Bible. We really brought that up and like, hey, is that really a thing? And if you haven't listened to those episodes, folks, I suggest you go listen to those, because right after that we talk about the Illuminati, or not really the Illuminati, but the different bloodlines, like of the royalty and just so many things that came out of these Nephilim kind of bloodlines and created pretty much, royalty throughout our human history. And, that's part of the plan. They've always wanted to kind of enslave mankind, as you said, it kind of here in your book. And they try to do it through government and other ways like that. And then one big example that you came back on to talk about and how the end days could look like was the Nazi Germany situation. And that episode is probably our most downloaded episode. People really want it. I mean, everyone's always interested in Hitler, you know what I mean? But it's like, I think most people don't understand when you brought up the religious occult aspect of it in the background, it really blew people's mind. They're like, "Why? I thought he was Christian." A lot of people thought he was Christian. You know what I mean? Like they just don't realize exactly. Really the nonsense that was happening in the background. So I know you on the last time we had you said you were working on a part 2. And I think you said that first time you were saying that in public, you said it on my show. So woo, I'm so happy for that. But you're still working on that new book? What's going on, Gary?
I am. I actually have 2 books on the go. I set the first one aside that I was working on, that is about Second Exodus, and I'll try and complete that one after I finish the sequel to the Genesis 6 Conspiracy. I was just having so much contact with people that are saying, we want more information, not less. And my book is a very large book, but the specific information people tended to want to have more on is how much more is said in the Bible about all different kinds of giants, how many different names for the tribes of giants, how that fits in with the angelic hierarchy, how does that fit into the prophetic nature of the beast kingdoms, and is there a connection to the end time with prehistory? And so I deal in that in sort of at great length, and including I'm going through, as I'm working right now on the book, I'm doing the giant wars of the Exodus and walking through each of those campaigns and showing those connections. And as I walk through all of that, it's about connecting important parts of that history into why it's important to understand what's coming in the end time and where the beast kingdoms come from. So I think I'm hoping it's going to be what people were looking for, and hopefully I'll have that out hopefully I can get it into the publisher's hands in the next couple of 3 months and then out before the summer.
Ooh, I'm excited. So, let's get right into it, Gary, because sometimes I tend to babble on, and that's like the number one complaint I get from both my co-host and listeners. I talk too much, and sometimes I don't let the guests talk too much. And I know that you have lots of information, so I don't want to make this show me kind of sorting through my ideas. I want to definitely just let you loose. I want to release the Kraken with you, Gary, and just really just kind of go into it. You know what I'm saying?
No problem. I'm also a fan of a really sort of active, interactive conversation on things. So don't worry about, how much you say or how little you say. Just whatever you're comfortable with, and into the topic areas that you'd like to talk about. It's
very well.
Pretty simple.
Cool.
Yeah, pretty simple, and usually the best way to do it, I think.
Right. And so one thing that I think we've mentioned, and I just want to open it up a little bit more, because I think we wanted to talk about some kind of like end times, Bible prophecy, things like that. And I want to correlate that with like the giants, the Nephilim, and things like that. Only because, still till today, I currently go to a Calvary chapel, but like I've been to different churches, and I love to hear people, obviously preach the gospel, and all that stuff is amazing to me. But, very rarely, and I'm surprised actually one of the biggest Calvary chapels here in Southern California actually even brought up the notion of the return of the Nephilim, And I was very surprised to hear that pastor say, "Hey, the Nephilim are going to return," and he correlated it with even the alien phenomenon. I'm like, what? I can't believe I'm hearing this from the pulpit right now. This is crazy, and so I was excited, like I physically like propped myself up in my seat, and I was like, oh, this is the service that I want to hear, you know what I mean? And but I was surprised to hear it, but I started in the last year or two, because I'm trying to gather some information to do what I call an entertainment breakdown. And I've noticed how much in the culture of movies, there is the culture of movies, and also just TV shows, video games, even our mythology, anime has grown so much. There's a very popular one called Attack on Titan, and it is literally all about giants attacking the city, and how some of those humans can turn into giants. And so the thread that I've been seeing so much is that the Nephilim are returning, and they might not say that in the show, but it's exactly what they're talking about, and it just surprises me that I've seen it more and more. And one of the biggest perpetuators of that idea is the Marvel Avenger movies, which we did talk about on our show, me and you, and it's just like really selling that, like the Nephilim are returning, And just recently, I decided to start watching Daredevil, the TV series. And in there's the subplot, the one that's building in the background, is about the Nephilim, and I'm just kind of like, gosh, like this is everywhere, and in the show, they're just kind of saying like there's this ancient Japanese kind of like weapon that they need to use, and really they're just talking about this person that they're modifying their DNA, and humans can become stronger and different, and they basically get possessed by this ancient power, and it's kind of like a Nimrod story, And
they're coming out more and more with almost in your face, whereas they used to use a lot more allegory that only people of polytheist religions would really truly understand what what they were talking about. So seemingly to me that might be a sign that we're getting closer to the end, because they're in a sort of a hyper state of preparation of people, not only in the education systems, in the media, but also in the entertainment area, where they've always been quite dominant, which is usually connected back to the Rosicrucian Society that's funneling a lot of this information to the writers and the movie makers. But it's no longer like, what are they, who is this sort of bloodline that they're talking about? They're right in your face as to who they're talking about. So I think that's an indication that, we're approaching more closely to the days of Noah as one of the overarching signs that is discussed in the Gospel of Matthew and Mark, and then with Luke, with also adding in the days of Lot. So the days of Noah were 350 years after the flood and 600 years before the flood. So it's kind of framing both with the connection of Luke's overlay onto that sign. And that it's that if you look at the entertainment aspect of how the elite have dominated society. They set up a feudal system. They controlled all of the religions. They controlled who was in the priesthood at the leadership level, Christian and non-Christian. They were usually of the bloodlines. You have them controlling education, and they had basically they control all of the writings and the story. So when we see a lot of the sort of ancient history that's coming out, these are their belief systems. These are their history. These are their genealogies, and they're also telling us where they're going with it. And when we look at, let's say, Hollywood today, that is just an extension of what they've always done. So whether or not it's Shakespeare that would be connected back and into Bacon's he had two writing secret societies, if I can put it that way, because they're initiatory, not like a Rosicrucian, but from an artistic perspective. And one was the Knights of the Helmet, and the other one was the Spear Shakers Society, which likely Shakespeare took his name from. And they were developing not only literature for the English and recording their history, but they were trying to develop a new English language. And if you roll that sort of forward to a little bit more recent, so that people can have a better understanding, you have the Inkling Society that has been around for a few, several hundred years, and is sponsored by the Rosicrucian Golden Dawn Society. And you have writers like MacDonald, but more people probably don't remember them, but he was a very important figure as a mentor type of writing to Tolkien and Lewis. And so they're putting out this information so that people are not only entertained with that fairy tale aspect to the story and they're riveted by it, but they're still, even though they're more upfront in terms of what they're getting at, more clearer in those connections, they are still hiding information that's within the allegories and the backdrop. But if you're kind of patient and you're kind of looking for what does all of this kind of mean, you'll start to see some commonalities in some of the allegories and the symbolism that's in the show. And for people who end up reading my book, they find that they get a lot of help and a lot of that sort of allegory and symbolism as to what to look for when they're watching these kind of movies, even to the effect that the heroes today, as you were mentioning, are like the superheroes of old. These are the Nephilim, these are the Rephaim of old, the offspring of the gods and the human females, which were the great heroes in Greek mythology, and the same story of Genesis 6.
Right, which is so ancient and mythological, is that in all the other polytheistic religions and all these other forms that are separate from like the biblical story, it's always the Nephilim, it's always the Watchers, the fallen ones that rebelled against the creator one, whatever they call their creator in that story, that are the heroes of us, right? Like it's always them, and then the main creator is always the bad guy, or at the very least he's indifferent and he doesn't care about us anymore. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
And so it's just kind of replayed over.
Spin things in their dualism where they have like black magic and white magic, or they'll have, a good witch and an evil witch. So they would look at their dualistic religion, which is, perpetually in conflict in their belief with the God of all things, and that he is equal to their leader, which is Satan. And that nobody's ever going to win. So they sort of change and counterfeit a lot of things. But what's important to understand is that you also have good heroes and evil heroes in this type of entertainment. You need to understand, though, that the good hero is not representing anybody in the Bible. It is representing that internal conflict for power that they have within the dualistic and polytheist religions around the world, and the bloodlines that are trying to become, as in the Highlander movie, there can only be one, right? There can only be one antichrist, dragon, messiah put forward in the end time that's going to rule the whole earth. So that's that internal conflict that's going on.
Do you really think that things are like the show? Maybe, I don't know if you've seen the show, but the Game of Thrones, have you seen Game of Thrones?
I started watching the first year of it. I didn't really follow it, but I knew what they were getting at in terms of the story that they were going to tell. And it was basically an antediluvian or pre-flood story and as you saw, more of the characters and individuals coming out. It's just interesting that I think that they used, I think it was 9 different kingdoms. Typically the number's 4 or 7 before the flood, but I've also heard versions that are 11 and 13. So we're not real sure how many societies there were, cultures before the flood, but we knew there was more than one for sure. So
I guess what I was getting at is, because you mentioned earlier that Shakespeare, for example, that they've been doing this for a long time. These bloodlines, they control media in a sense, whatever the media is like in those ancient times. But there's a kind of a growing conspiracy. I don't know if you heard, but like more and more are people saying that the English language was created to enslave people. Have you heard about that? And just the way that it's used, it's just completely weird, and it's nuances about. Right. The same word can mean something else, and just it's just a very weird thing. And as they explain it, I guess it makes some sense, but I think fundamentally, I think it there's some truth to it, just because of how we can use words, and I know that spell casting and writing out of spells in a certain way is incredibly important in the occult world, and how you use words. So I guess it kind of makes sense to me, but I don't, when you were saying that, this, he was trying to create a different English language, I wonder if it has anything to do with that,
Well, it's from their perspective and their power base, that is what he was trying to do. They wanted to have a language that they could take worldwide. That would be the dominant language, and it was going to be the new language, but a changed language from the sort of Middle English, and they wanted to have it to be part of the world empire that they imagined was going to come out. And so by the time of King James I, who takes over the throne from Elizabeth, and James is from Scotland, and so he's not the first in Scotland, but he's James the First in England. He is the one that is going to sponsor the King James Version Bible. So the language that is coming out of these writing guilds of the Knights of the Helmet and the Spear Shaker Society by numerous writers, we're developing this language that is now going into the King James Version Bible. And the thought is that as King James expands his empire to be worldwide, which will eventually be the British Empire, and also understand that it's Francis Bacon that is the biggest proponent and pusher of exploring the New World, to be the first to be there to get control of those lands that have been really not part of civilization as we would understand it from a European perspective as we get out of history, and that this is the language that is proposed by Francis Bacon to be the language in the new Atlantis that he writes. And so if people aren't familiar with Francis Bacon, the new Atlantis in his alchemical writings, he becomes the spiritual founder for the Royal Society, and his painting still hangs in there today. That's formed in 1662. That is the first wedge of modern science in the seven sacred sciences that we understand as the seven liberal arts taught in universities today, and all knowledge and science still answers back to him. And his book about the new Atlantis, which is again this allegory of this 10-king empire of the Atlantean Empire ruled over by demigods, the offspring of Poseidon and a human female, is the world that he wants to reintroduce, where Nephilim are ruling the earth, and their bloodline families are the complete elite, and they're walking and working with the fallen angels just as it was in the Golden Age. And that's the world that he wants to bring in. And so in the New Atlantis book, this is going to be the language of that time, was his vision, and that this would be a time when religion and science would be in harmony again as they move into this new sort of age that we would understand it today, that is the new golden age, as Francis Bacon would have talked about it. So from a particular set of bloodlines coming from who Francis Bacon as a Rosicrucian was working with, that's exactly what they had in mind. But they have many, many rivals as to who's ultimately going to be that antichrist that wins out. So that English may or may not be the language of the New World Order, or the Nephilim World Order, as I like to call it. But that was sort of the idea that he had.
Right. It makes sense. You said like Francis Bacon. I mean, he obviously, you're saying that he's part of a specific bloodline, or at least a secret society, right?
Yes, as a member of the Rosicrucians.
There you go. So
you essentially have to be part of a bloodline.
Oh, there you
go. At least in that time. Today, as you look at the Rosicrucian Society, it's, let's say at the top 50% level is all pure blood. And the bottom level would be made up of rising people through Freemasonry and the Illuminati and other lower level secret societies that would rise to that level. So they would have a degree that's higher than 33rd degree or third degree York rank.
As the Harry Potter people would say, we would be mudbloods.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, what I was getting at was, when you said that, he infiltrated pretty much our academic system, and now we have these liberal arts, and they're basically the ones that were made from the seven sacred sciences in these secret societies. It makes sense that it would come from like the fallen ones, the Nephilim, or like the fallen watchers, because I was thinking the other day, because we understand as Christians that there is a, we might not see it with our own eyes, but there's a spiritual battle happening and around us, and some of that manifests itself into our existence here in the reality that we live in, but it's happening around us, and one thing that I realize is, I feel like the world has to be at a certain, and I'm using their terms, I guess the terms of like these new age religions, there needs to be a certain energy, right? There needs to be a certain level of depravity, or there needs to be a certain level of fallenness in order for them to establish themselves with their Nephilim world order that they're trying to establish. So it would make sense, I think, that, for example, and maybe I'm reaching here, but it doesn't surprise me that more and more is it growing, this whole idea that there's all these genders, or that there are no genders, or things like that, or that there's gender fluidity, when that also existed in the polytheistic gods, where they can, they switched genders and things like that, and then they can be male, they can be female, or they were both, and things like that. And it almost feels like it's reflecting the spiritual world. You know what I'm saying?
It does, and that's the thing that is always one of those telltale signs, is when you see these types of things, look for how that is connected and reflecting and honoring the pantheon of gods, because that's what the knowledge is good and knowledge can be used for evil. So it's not the knowledge, it's how it's used.
Right,
But
right.
the seven sciences were created in the beginning with Enoch, son of Cain, who dispensed the knowledge into the seven sciences. And then at the start of the Royal Society that we mentioned a few minutes ago, they established the same basic goals as what was done in the time of Cain and the time of the giants, is that they wanted to lead people away from God with this knowledge. They wanted to not give God credit for anything in this world. They wanted to degrade or dismiss God and to finally to honor their pantheon of gods. So those are always the telltale signs of the strings that are pulling the puppets of education and science. That and when we look at it and we see that today, I mean, God is right out of the equation of anything. Creationism is right out of the availability of adding to the thought of anything. And it's all designed to influence people's minds, to tell them that God either doesn't exist or is just another angel like the other angels, or another alien like the other aliens, but no more powerful. And you're going to see that sort of come back from that sort of atheistic secular perspective to more the polytheist perspective as we move forward, so that there will be that marriage again of polytheist religion and science, just as it was throughout the ancient world and through the beast kingdoms.
Now, I don't know if I've asked you this question before, but I don't think I have. I just kind of mentioned it in passing in some episodes. Now, if all these giants, at the very least, we know that they're trying to modify. It's open. If you don't know about CRISPR technology, folks out there, you're kind of behind. But they're trying to modify the genetic structure of human beings. Right? That's just something that's the future. You see it on if you go to YouTube and subscribe to for example, the World Economic Forum, you'll probably get a little scared if you knew what was coming, because I'm subscribed to them and I see their videos and I'm like, oh my gosh, like it's happening right now. Like they're really focusing on this fourth industrial revolution, and part of that fourth industrial revolution that they are forcing upon us, because of what's going on with this. I don't want to say the words, but what was going on with this whole virus thing, you know what I mean? It's really pushing this forward. But my point is that they're really focusing on modifying the humans, and they're trying to make us different. Now, my question originally, what I was going to say is, if all of this was real, like as far as the giants, how come we don't hear much about finding these giant bones all the time? You know what I mean? How come we don't hear about? Because I know the information is out there as far as at least the religions that came out of the polytheism and these giant Nephilim bloodlines. But you think really, like, okay, so where are these bones? Where are they?
Well, they're out there. They're well hidden and well kept. There's a few organizations that have worked in the last 2,000 years to control the information, one being the Roman Catholic Church. They would have a number of these types of skeletons that were found. There was giants in the time of the Romans. They have documented giants over 10 feet tall. Mm-hmm. And so you also have the secret societies, particularly via the Royal Society, that is collecting these bones and putting them in their basements and their storage facilities. And, Freemasonry, which is linked to the Rosicrucians and the Roman Catholic Church, are the two biggest libraries of occult knowledge and history in the world. And they're sort of rivals of each other. In North America, and there's a link that people can go to. It's called Old Newspapers Stories, and if people want to get a hold of me, I'll send them the link, and it'll take you to a link of newspaper stories of giant bones being found all around North America. Mm-hmm. And what happens is they either go directly back to the Smithsonian, or it goes to your local university, and then the paper trail goes to the Smithsonian, and at that level, the paper trail is lost, and they're no longer apparently exist after that. But I think they're keeping those bones. And understand that the Smithsonian Society comes from the inheritance and the money of James Smithson, who was a member of the Royal Society and a Rosicrucian, and he funded this organization in the United States. So they're controlling the information.
And that's what people don't realize, is that everything that is like a standard or a staple, all these names like Rockefeller Institute, Smithsonian, even the cities nearby here in Southern California, for example, Irvine was totally built and funded by the Irvine family. They were part of the Bohemian Grove and all kinds of different things like that. Like, if they just follow the money, that's like the number one rule. Follow the money.
Follow the money, follow the power.
Follow the power, see where it comes from, and you'll see that your history was built on lies,
Yeah. Yeah, and then they only want us to know what they want us to know, and that's where we're at right now when they're starting to show us a little bit more, but they won't show us the full hand. And I was interested when you were talking about changing DNA and the ability that we have to do that today. And I look at how it was in the days of Noah before the flood, and one might argue even that possibly at Nimrod there was a significant amount of knowledge that was being used there as well that got dispersed at Babel. But the whole earth was corrupted, and it's not just the people were violent and weren't expecting the flood and or were godless or were polytheist. It was the whole earth was corrupted. That's the Hebrew word shakath. And that means decayed, destroyed, changed, mutated, words like that. So when we start to think about when the whole earth was corrupted, what does that mean? It means that all of the plant genomes were changed, or most of them were at least. It means that animal DNA was changed. It means human DNA was changed, and that only 8 were selected for the ark that were free of that contamination, and God called animals that were representative or kind species of the earth's animals that had not been corrupted to the ark, because he knew the ones that weren't. And so when we start to think about, okay, we're just now catching up to that kind of technology that was talked about before the flood. Now let's link in the language. I think you might find this interesting. So when you get into the book of Revelations, in Revelation 18, the whole world is deceived and led astray by the sorceries of Babylon, which is the end time universal religion, which was the sponsor for the 7 sacred sciences. They're sort of wedded together, and people need to understand that. Sorceries is used a few different times. You have sorcerer, or sorcerers, and sorceries, but it all goes back to the same set of words of pharmakeia, pharmakous, and pharmakos. And those are the root words for pharmaceuticals of today. So when we're talking about products that are included in that group, both legal and illegal, and ones that have to do with curing diseases, that is the word that is used for sorceries. And also understand sorceries can mean magic, spells, and charms, which might be the translation, if you're not reading the King James, that it might say. So this language was put in by the King James Version translators using King James is English, understanding that the people who created the Royal Society, you'll like this, called themselves the last of the sorcerers and the first of the scientists.
Yeah, man. I think a lot of people don't realize that a lot of the knowledge for a very long time, when it comes to quote unquote science or scientists, has come from these secret societies at the top. Like at the top, there are always someone either like alchemists, or working on something, changing it all. A lot of it derives from these like people that belong to secret societies, and they had their specific agendas. And I kind of feel like, bringing back what I said earlier, I kind of feel like there's a Game of Thrones, like a literal Game of Thrones of bloodlines, of like
there is.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to get into. That's why I brought the show up, because there seems to be, like you said earlier, the Catholic Church versus the royal bloodlines, and even though they're doing similar evil things, I feel like they're battling it out for who's going to be, on that throne. You know what I mean? Like who is going to be on that throne. And I don't know if through your research, I know that there is definitely this battling it out, but do they all think they're going to be like the one that brings in the Antichrist? Like what is their point in trying to battle it out with each other? What's going on there?
Because there can only be one. So that dynasty that's going to rule the new Atlantis will populate all the upper echelons of governance and kingdoms around the earth. So you can imagine the 10 king empire that's coming. They're going to want to, the Antichrist will at some point in time, if permitted, would replace all of those 10 kings with his own bloodline relatives, right? So they're all sort of competing for who's going to be the one that can present that. And so if you get into the epistles of John or in the book of Matthew and Mark, there are, and Jesus warns us that there are antichrists in plural that we need to be aware of. So there'll be multiple antichrists in the end time, and some of them will come forward before the true antichrist. And they're going to deceive a lot of people, so that by the time this Antichrist figure finally rises to the top, we'll have seen multiple Antichrist figures, whether or not it's the Lord Maitreya of the Hindu religion and Buddhist religion, or the Mahdi of Islam. I'll get into maybe some of the bloodlines that I'm talking about in a couple of minutes, but understand that there'll be multiple ones of these ones, just as Gog and the Gog War, because you take that back to Greek or back to Hebrew, not only does it mean a giant at a polytheism and the offspring of Iapetus, one of the parent gods in Greek mythology, as well as Magog. And Gog is not in the Table of Nations, but Magog is. And in the end time war, it's Gog of Magog that is talked about, that we may see this Antichrist figure, because Gog is defined in both Hebrew and Greek as being an end time Antichrist figure, but not the Antichrist. So we want to be aware that there could be multiple ones, and that's going to be a war that looks like Armageddon. And makes it a little easier than for Antichrist taking credit for winning that war, just as Jesus would come in at the time of Armageddon and promise the millennium. That's exactly what Antichrist is going to do. So we need to be understanding that there's going to be multiple Antichrists from different bloodlines around from around the world. So you've got several European bloodlines, and people are familiar with some of them. Obviously, the Windsors are going to have a significant play in this from the English throne and all of their scioning of bloodlines. That also includes the Stuart bloodline. But you've got families like the St. Clairs, which are the Sinclairs. You've got families like the Lorraine Habsburg dynasty, and the Lorraine region produced Anjou, de Payon and de Bouillon, the creators of the Knights Templar, and you've got bloodlines like the Plantagenet, which a lot of the presidents take their bloodlines back to, which is an extension of the Anjou. And the Anjou originally held, starting in 1118, the King of Jerusalem title. And they see that the Grand Monarch is going to be coming out in Gezer, where the cutting of the elms took place that split the inner core adept level bloodline Royal Masonic line away from the standard Templar line, because they lost their way. And of course, if you're making a connection into history, that's the same time as Jerusalem was lost. And so the inner core is saying, you've lost your way and you've lost Jerusalem for us, and they split away. And so you've got the de Geezers family as well, and you've got, and I won't go through all of the European ones, but all of them are in the French sort of bloodline. They see the Grand Monarch entering through the Grand Arch in Gezer for his start to climb to become the Dragon Messiah of the world, or the King of Jerusalem title, as the Anjou were crowned in 1118 in a small priory on the Rock of Sion. And so that current title is held by the Bourbon family of Spain, and the King of Spain, King Philippe, who got the title from his father, Juan Carlos, who got it from the Habsburg-Lorraine dynasty, which was in the Lorraine region. For a wide period of time during the Middle Ages, and funneled through another Anjou family in Hungary that Vlad the Impaler is connected to. But I won't go down that rabbit hole because you just keep opening up doors here. But you get an idea that there's multiple bloodlines in play just on the European level.
Mm-hmm.
In China, you've got...
I just saw a map the other day of all the countries that were invaded or taken over by, Europe, and it was impressive. I mean, there was very little countries that weren't touched by Europe, and how much I think the meme was like, how come most of the world is Eurocentric, and then it shows the map of how much they spread,
Yeah.
So
they were in a dominant control not that long ago, and then they had a big civil war, big inter-family war in World War I, which in World War II is just an extension of World War I. So you had intermarriage between, the
wait. So are
royal
you
family
saying
of England
World
with
War?
Russia?
Sorry to cut you off there, but are you saying World War I and II was more about these Game of Thrones than anything else?
Yes. European Game of Thrones. So right, and then you have a few other ones in there, like the Yamamoto family, right? As which is a bloodline that comes out of the Li family from the dragon creators out of China, who, they all come from the Shah dynasty over there. And so
that dragon pops up everywhere, huh?
He comes from that bloodline as well. But World War I, to answer your question, is the family the Tsars that ran Russia, the Kaisers that ran Germany, the Habsburgs in Austria, the Bourbons that were in Spain, the Windsors in England, and all the royal powers of Europe were all cousins because they were still intermarrying. It was a Game of Thrones from the family to eliminate some of the Eastern bloodlines or make them way less powerful and subservient or vassals to them.
And does that connect like Stalin and Mussolini and like?
Well, World War II is part of World War I. It's the resolution.
Oh, I see.
World War II is because of World War I. So that's just the resolution.
Got it.
So you have the overthrow of that bloodline with the communist revolution, which is funded by the Western royal families and the banks, right? Yeah. And it becomes so powerful that they got to create Nazism to offset communism. And of course, you have Nazism that's replaced the Kaiser bloodline in Germany, and then they get out of control. So they got to take them out because they were worse than the communists that they had created.
Yeah.
So, but when you look at Russia today, you don't have the czars in control, but you've got an interesting fellow by the name of Putin, whose name comes out of nowhere in about the 1850s from his grandfather. And what traditionally would happen in Russia with the nobility is if they had children out of wedlock, they would give them part of their name. And so his name actually comes from the Putyanin out of the Kiev, Ukraine area, which was the original starting place and the original bloodline families of the original czars. The Romanovs didn't take over till the 1600s, and they replaced the Putyanin. But the Putyanin still have the bloodlines in the Ukraine. And so if you wonder why Putin has such an interest in the Ukraine, he wants that because that's part of his bloodline inheritance, and he wants to take things back to the original state of the bloodlines, which comes out of the Cossacks and the whole bloodlines out of the Ukraine. So you need to understand the bloodlines as part of the politics.
Yeah, there really is a cosmic geographical war going on all the time, and we always just see it in just a very, I don't know, obscure fashion. I mean, obviously, intentionally, it's presented to your everyday citizen as, we're fighting communism. That's why America was all about it. Let's go fight communism and let's stand up. They really sold that, and they made, they really kind of fed the Christian people here in America the idea of how evil and how demonic communism is, and everybody rose up. But what I'm saying is like there's so much manipulation, and really we're just a part of that kind of like cosmic geographical war, you know?
Yeah. And so when we roll that forward to the New Atlantis, or the 10 kings of the end time empire, the 10 horns and the 10 toes, as you go through, Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 8, Revelation 13 and 17, where basically cross-references all of those different allegories for these kings, is that these are going to be 10 representatives from groups of nations from around the world. And so what Putin is doing, or what Xi is doing in China, is they're not against the new Nephilim world order. They just want a bigger influence, and they want to have a reinstatement of their historical empire. And that's what they're looking for going into this. So when we look at what is currently taking place, one should expect that China is going to expand. One should expect that Russia is going to expand. And what's really interesting is we look at the metallic empires as they're described in Daniel 2, and you get into, I think, verses 38 to 40, is you actually have descendants or rulers of this 10-toed empire, as they're described in Daniel 2, of the metallic empires, the one of clay and of iron, and iron and clay don't mix. And part of that, in that allegory of not mixing, is you have the seed, you have some of these 10 kings mixing their seed with humankind, which is a very, very bizarre passage in Deuteronomy 2 at the end of the prophecy, and as a definition to the prophecy. But what we understand is that Nephilim somehow, some way, or Rephaim somehow, some way, and or their bloodlines, or both, are going to play a significant part of the end time. And that we need to understand that, and we need to be open to things that seem almost impossible and unimaginable today. But I think that's why the entertainment is preparing people, because to think about giants and the genealogies of these giants that go back into prehistory and back to specific gods, people aren't ready for that. So they have to be prepared.
I recently spoke with Doug Riggs. Have you heard of his work?
No, I'm not familiar with his work.
So Doug Riggs works with people that are pretty much like in satanic ritual abuse. That's his job. He kind of reintegrates people's minds after they've been pretty much broken, turned into split personalities and things like that, And the people that he's, been, I guess, blessed, because God put him there for sure. He's a Christian man, and he's been working with these people. He works with a lot of people that are like very, very high up in. We're talking royal bloodlines. We're talking like, not even that. I was telling him, there's higher bloodlines, I understand, but like, he works with, for example, this lady. She is a Rothschild,
Mm-hmm.
And she is a daughter, I believe, of Philip, Prince Philip, or something like that, and another Rothschild. They had a child together or something, and she's basically like their daughter or something. I could be getting the names wrong, things like that.
Sure,
but
that's what they do.
Right.
So.
Okay, perfect. So,
Yep.
So they had a child, and apparently she grew up and she was part of these ritual abuses, and he's working with her to try to reintegrate her mind. And one story that she brought up that was very interesting, which kind of he's honest in saying, like, a lot of the stories they say, I don't know if they're true or not, but my job isn't to find out whether their stories are true. My job is to try to reintegrate the brain, So I have to work through the information that they're spilling out as they're speaking. But one of the things that she mentioned is that in Vegas, under what we call the Vegas Strip, there's like a tunnel system that apparently she was led through, and that is only the royals have access to. And she was taken to pretty much like a deep underground military base, and they would do their rituals or whatever right there. But they were also working on something they called the Nephilim project, and that's something that came out of her mouth, or her, and she says that they have these people basically there that they either take and they're trying to like modify them. And then it's kind of like in a movie where they're in these like tubs of water kind of thing, like those tubes of water, and they're just trying to change the human body kind of thing, and I've always wondered, like, okay, how we've heard stories, we have movies, about like Hitler trying to do this with people back in World War II.
The new man,
right? The Uberman, and that's where we get like our Superman from. And then Superman's connected to all these other ancient, Canaanite gods and all this other stuff too. If you look at the word,
the House of El,
the House of El, exactly. And so there's all these connections that if people just knew the language a little bit, it just kind of opens up these doors, right? But my question is, do you think that we just have like people that look like people, but they're basically already Nephilim or something, or you think that's actually, I don't know, man. It's just kind of weird to think about it. Like, hey, what are they doing? If what she saw was real and true, which there's more information, but I don't want to elongate the story, but like there's more information that she said to make it seem like what she was talking about. At the very least, the very least we know that DUMBs exist, deep underground military bases. We know that exists. Now we don't know what's going on down there, but it's like she was talking about it like, yeah, that's what I do, and she had clearance for it, and apparently even the code she had, they tested it, and the code was a high level clearance that not even like our people have. So it was one of those things, and I'm just kind of like, wow, that's kind of creepy.
Well, here's some things to think about then. One is we have to be careful of the misinformation that they put out, right? It gives them more protection, and we have to try and discern what is
real or
truthful and not. And the second thing is it doesn't matter whether or not we believe with what they're saying. It's that it matters with if they believe it, which they do, and what they're doing with that belief system. Now, when you look at these underground caverns, and you look at in the days of Noah, we have places like Petra or Gobel Tepe or so many other places around the world where they created these gigantic underground cities. And it seems to me that that's what they're trying to recreate again today. And further to that, you have in Revelation 6, for example, at the opening of the seals, that the 25% destruction that's going to happen over the earth is so great that even the polytheist kings and queens and the nobility are climbing into their caves for protection because they think it's the day of the Lord. It's not the day of the Lord yet, but they think it is. The destruction is that high. I don't think these are caves. I think these are their underground dwelling places that they've built everywhere for protection, just as some people theorize that these were used to protect them from the flood. They'll use this to protect them from the apocalypse by fire in the next go around. And so in these places, it's common, whether it's truthful or it's not, is that they've got Nephilim in stasis, or they're trying to recreate the Nephilim bodies, or they're trying to create some sort of clone beings of some sort. So we don't know whether or not what's going on there is this a scientific basis with DNA manipulation and things like that, or is this a recreation with angels that aren't in the abyss? Because not all the fallen angels are in the abyss. Only the ones who committed the worst atrocities to humankind and were impassioned went into the abyss, both before and after the flood, if you're part of a second incursion fan or follower, which I am in terms of how giants show up.
These fallen ones,
I was just going to finish up that. Yeah. If they're not recreating that way, they could be creating bodies as oikaterians, or a dwelling place for the spirit, for the demons that are going to require bodies in the end time. And so when we have like this Gog individual that we talked about, is he going to be somebody that is newly created, or is this the spirit of the demon that is either in the abyss that would be released before the midpoint of the last 7 years? Because the demons are in the sides of the abyss, as Ezekiel 32 tells us, and is specifically talking about Rephaim and giants before, who's talking to the Pharaoh from the cells of the abyss. There are also demons that are roaming the earth. So whether or not they're preparing first for them to have bodies or a dwelling place to interact with people in the physical world, and where I get that dwelling place from for the spirit that they require to interact, that comes from Jude 1:6, where it's talking about the angels that left their habitation, and that's the Greek word oikaterion, which means a dwelling place for their spirit. So. And you also get it used one more time in 2 Corinthians 5 with the house in heaven, just as Jesus promised God has a large mansion with a lot of rooms in heaven for us, a dwelling place. That this is a requirement both in heaven and for the earth to have a dwelling place for the spirit. And in the physical world on earth, if you want to physically interact in the world, you need to have a soul and a body, which is the oikaterion for the spirit, that they can interact with the world. And I think we need to be open to that. They're doing some of the above or all of the above in those types of places, because you get so much information out there. The big point is not how they're going to create them or bring them back, is that seemingly they're determined to bring them back. And that's what we need to be concerned about.
Yeah, and that's kind of like my point. Like, I feel like we mentioned earlier, it's in movies, it's in everywhere, and it's also part, going back to the World Economic Forum. We have all these NGOs, these non-governmental organizations that pretty much manage our governments, which is kind of weird, right? But nobody questions, and when have you ever looked into the people in charge of these NGOs, Gary, and like their names and who they are and if they belong to these bloodlines? I mean, I'm not surprised if they're not, obviously, you know what I mean? Like, but it just seems like it makes sense to me. I mean, the most famous name is Klaus Schwab, right? And Klaus Schwab is all over the place, I believe he's German in descent. I'm not sure, but I'm just wondering,
Here's what I would say to that is it's important to understand those people as being lower level bloodlines that are visible. And even the Rothschilds, they were named the Bauer family in Germany before they were funded to create the banks to replace the Knights Templar. And they changed their name to Rothschild when they set up the London Bank in 1810 to 1812, as my memory serves me. And that name, obviously has a meaning to them as being sort of like the Red Shield, and I won't go into all of it, but they chose that name for a reason. But they are sort of front and center for the banking, but they're not the pure bloodlines. They have ennobled themselves over the generations, which is what these people are doing. Is they're trying to, whether or not it's the Schwab family or it's the Bill Gates family, they're trying to have their descendants or their offspring intermarry into the bloodlines and ennoble themselves to a higher level of position down the road and in future generations. So you're never going to find the people that are really funding it and really sponsoring it, because they're not going to be front and center. And so that's where you get into those Royal Masonic orders that you were talking about, associated with the underground cities and rituals and things like that, is that they are still pulling the strings. They're just not sort of visibly out there today. And it's those families that we'll need to be more concerned about, as opposed to the ones that are out doing the work for them. Another classic example for people to understand that, and I think you were mentioning the Bohemian Society, which is a lot of times associated with the Illuminati, which is lower than the Rosicrucians. And so the Bohemian group is more focused in North America and who's in power in North America. So lower level bloodlines reporting into adepts of the Illuminati that report report up, would be, if I could describe the secret society as a tree trunk, and Illuminati is higher than the Freemasons, but the Rosicrucians are higher up on the trunk. Bohemian society link branches into the Illuminati trunk part, but let's say the Club of Rome would be either reporting into the top level of the Rosicrucians or to the Committee of 300, which is above the Rosicrucians, because of the bloodlines that we know are running the Club of Rome, or the Bilderbergers, where they go back to those direct families and that are barely visible, and only from an organizational perspective, but they're bringing in people in the Bilderberger organization, in this case, like Bill Gates and the Clintons and that, for a yearly meeting, and they get sent back on their marching orders. So that's how you need to understand what's really going on, is if they're visible, if they're too visible, I guess is the better way of phrasing it, is they are people that are trying to climb the ladder and the more purity of the bloodlines by intermarrying with the more pure bloodlines with their descendants. So
yeah, they stay in the shadows.
That's why
pretty much.
Yeah. So that's why it's so hard to get around the misinformation, right? Because people don't understand how the secret societies are organized,
right,
and who's at the top and who's at the bottom. And some people will say, oh, it's the Freemasons that control things. Some people will say it's Illuminati. Some people will say the Jesuits. They're all part of the hierarchical order. You just need to understand where they fit in.
As far as you can tell, what organization, you said like the Club of 300 or things like that, like what group is pretty much at the top that isn't the fallen entities themselves? You know what I mean? The fallen watchers, the fallen ones that are basically, I would assume, at the very top, there's actually possibly even physical fallen angels or these fallen entities giving direct orders to some physical family or group or whatever, and then it spills from there, you know? But as far as you can tell, who seems to be close to the top there?
So in the West, people have probably heard the 13 families, right?
Okay.
And there's a lot of debate over who the Western 13 families are. But you can bet the Windsors are in there. Go back to the Hanovers, and you can bet that the Anjou are in there, and families like that we talked about earlier. But that's just sort of the West. But they would make up that. As you go up that tree trunk, you have the Rosicrucians, you have the Committee of 300, and those are all pure bloodline families, but there's quite a few of them. Then you have the Council of 33, and then you have the 13 families. But you also have bloodline families around the world, right? Like the Li family out of China, or the Roca family out of the Inca bloodlines in South America, or the Singh family and the Khan families and bloodlines out of India, and on and on and on and on. So each sort of area of the world has that type of organizational structure through bloodlines as well, and those are part of that global competing bloodlines. And what happens in the West is we get too West-centric, or too North American-centric, or too U.S.-centric in terms of our view, and we have to take a step back to understand the bigger picture. Now, if you understand that the original Nephilim before the flood and Rephaim after the flood were set up to be the divine representatives of the gods on earth, you'll understand why it's important they keep their genealogies and what that purity of that genealogy is, going back to specific sets of Nephilim who ruled and to specific fallen angels who produced them. And so they would answer up into the angelic hierarchy accordingly. So, and I won't go into complete sort of speech on angelology, but understand in Psalm 82 there's the Council of the Gods. And these are the gods that rule over the 70 nations of the earth. And we get that 70 nations of Deuteronomy 32, who the gods reign over. And sorry about my dog.
No worries.
And that 70 nations comes from the 70 descendants after the flood that are listed in the table of nations in First Chronicles and Genesis 10, and also from numbered as the numbers of the sons of Jacob that were born in Egypt, and numbered by the same amount of sons of Adam before the flood. And so these are the angels that ruled over them, over the 70 original nations, both before and after the flood, produced their demigod offspring to report back up to them. And then as the world funneled out, there would be countries that are branch countries of those originally 7 nations. So you would see a hierarchy of that council of 70 being extended over the different sort of dynasties and kingdoms that were branching off as the population of the world got bigger. So hopefully I said that in some sort of organized manner that people can get an understanding of how that organizational structure works.
Right. No, yeah, it makes sense. So is it safe to say that every major bloodline, you know, the ones in the shadows and maybe even the ones that are a little bit more known, like these families, do they all have an origin story, or at least believe they have an origin story with a demigod or something like that?
Yes. Yes, and they keep their genealogies. And so I'll give you a good example as to sort of how you can kind of make that connection. So Prince Charles, and if you Google it, he has said a couple of times and is on record on saying it, that his genealogy goes back to Vlad the Impaler. And Vlad the Impaler is the individual that Dracula and vampire movies are essentially based on, with that bloodline. And understand that Vlad the Impaler was a red hair, hazel-eyed, pale skin, allergic to daylight, part of the mystical religions, was educated in the University of Solomon in Vienna, in a mystical school. And he was a bloodline that goes back to the Tuatha De Danann, who were blonde-haired, blue-eyed, pale-skinned, or red hair, hazel-eyed, and pale-skinned, just as the Aryans of the Nazis are connected to. And he takes his bloodlines back to Scythia and the Tuatha De Danann, who escaped in the polytheist version from Tartarus, or the abyss, after the flood. And that the angel that they take their pedigree back to is sometimes known as, and this is Vlad the Impaler, sometimes known as Tamiel, or as we would see his name show up in the book of Enoch, Kezidiah, and they have a whole sort of mythos around why he has 2 different names or 2 different titles. So as one example, they would all have that as part of their pedigree and proof with the genealogies, because however pure your bloodline is, and however it's been more ennobled with other pure bloodlines, is where you fit into the hierarchy of the bloodlines that run the earth.
Are they either marrying other royals, or they're literally marrying their own bloodline?
They'll be intermarrying other bloodlines from other Nephilim and other fallen angels, because they want to ennoble it. Their bloodlines, that they'll have 2 pure bloodlines or 3 pure bloodlines.
I wonder if, I mean, just, I'm trying to take it back to today. Like, I wonder if, like, in the closed doors, that's their conversation, like, over there in Buckingham Palace or whatever. Like, you know, like, are they just talking about these in terms of, like, we need to keep our bloodline noble and things like that, or are they actually bringing up this, you know, ancient past history and saying
they are?
They are.
And it's all they are, and it's why the coat of arms will change at times from one generation to the other. Not every generation, because sometimes they will have married within the already established scion of bloodlines. And so if you look at the coat of arms, you're seeing emblematics of symbols that describe their genealogy. So the Stuart dynasty in the Hanover dynasty out of Germany, which became the Windsor family, and understand that Prince Charles, originally married into more Stuart bloodlines back into the bloodline with his intermarriage, and of course will probably produce the king, one of Charles's sons for who's going to be a king of England down the road. But on their coat of arms they had the unicorn. Which is, again, takes you back to King James, that they're using a symbol out of the Bible that is a horse with a horn. And unicorn in the Bible goes back to the Hebrew word ram, which is a wild bull. So this is an occultic understanding of what a unicorn was. And a unicorn was a horse before the flood that Nephilim kings would ride on. And it was mythically said to have a horn. And it was also mythically understood that it pulled the chariots of the gods, like Zeus, that they would have these unicorn horses that were riding it, and or cherubim. And so when you see the allegory of the unicorn, that's in there representing King James's bloodline as being a Stuart king, and that they'll take their bloodlines back to, in part, a cherubim angel. And cherubim is also represented on earth as an eagle at times. So when you see like the Anunnaki, that are angels with wings that have an eagle face, that would be how they would be represented. So you need to understand the allegories of the occult. Now, if you get into something a little bit more obvious, like a dragon, well, that is signifying a seraphim angel, because they were heavenly dragons with 6 wings.
Yeah, I see that symbol a lot.
Or the lions, which would go back to gods like Nergal or Bast or Mahis, all of these lion gods. So they'll code within their, not to get too long in detail on this, but I just want to give enough examples that they're actually showing from their coat of arms what angels, and obviously then their offspring and bloodlines, have been encoded or scioned into their bloodlines.
Well, I'm going to change gears a little bit here, but it's still relevant to everything that you research and things like that. But I do really want to talk a little bit more about mythology, and I know you know about certain very popular movies and books quite well, and really the origin of their mythology is a little bit more concerning than people might think. And, excuse me. Oh, sorry. So I really wanted to get into, we talked about giants and, where the bones, right? And you talked about the Smithsonian and who funds that and how they can get rid of those bones, or flip the story on the bones. I heard they've also lied about what the bones are, or these are dinosaur bones and things like that, But I suggest people follow that. I follow this page on Instagram called Giants of America, and they're constantly posting old newspaper articles from the early 1900s and things like that, with people like archaeologists finding bones all over the place in all places of all over the world, but specifically in America. That's why it's called Giants of America, and you'd be surprised just how much of these bones are everywhere. But in your research, Gary, because it seems that a lot of the things that we think are myth or mythological, and I think you've explained this before, they've hijacked that word to say that things that are mythological are not true, are not real. And that isn't the case. And there's more and more proof that the things that we consider myth or quote unquote not true are actually very true. You even kind of discussed a little bit about the unicorn and what it really means. And I mean, it just, my mind goes wild trying to find out how much of the creatures we consider mythological were real. Like centaurs were mentioned in the Bible, we're talking about, what about that, what are they called? Like the half goat, half man.
Satyr.
Yes, and things like that, and there's so much going on there that you're just kind of like, what are we not going to talk about this? Especially when you start reading the Bible in its original language, and you get, like even starting with like a Strong's concordance, and you start looking at words, you're like, wait a minute, that's a different word. There's the creatures there that a lot of people are well aware of, like the satyr and the like centaur type creatures, and that we're like, no, those are myth, those aren't real, but there seems to be some truth to it, and so I'm wondering, have you ever heard in the past or in your research or things like that about like elves and gnomes and things like that?
Well, they're called the elementals.
The elementals.
The elementals. And
Who
there
calls
are
them that?
4 classifications of elementals. And we actually get elemental in the New Testament. And it might say elemental, and it might say rudiments. And it's used not only for the elemental parts of the earth, but they're talking about rulership and governorship of these elements or rudiments, as you look up those words in the New Testament. And in the occult, the elementals were the little people that were 3 groups, and then the 4th group is the salamander group, and they were larger than the little people, and they were reptilians. And in the occult, it represents the 4 elements of fire and water and things like that. But within the 3 smaller groups, you have ones that are the good-looking fairies, and you have ones that are the mischievous fairies as a second group, like the leprechauns, for example. And then you have the ugly ones in another group, like the trolls or the gnomes or the hobbits or the dwarfs, those kind of ones. And they're at the bottom of the whole angelic hierarchy. So the little people are lower than the salamanders, and then the Nephilim are higher than that, and then you get into the angelic realm in the angelic hierarchy. So they're part of that hierarchy, but at the lowest level. So people are really familiar with the dwarves, for instance, and the dwarves, they lived in the mountains and in the earth, like the hobbits did. But the dwarves had, as all the little creatures that were created, had specific roles in the polytheist world, and the dwarves would make the great weapons for the giants and for the gods. And the gnomes, for example, would look after all of the technology and the genealogies and the knowledge. So each of the little people had the same role. And these same 3 groups of the little people are in all cultures, all around the world, on all continents, and it's the exact same 3 cultures. They just have different names, again, for the different types of the little people classification.
Were they hybrids, though, or what were they? Like, or were they already like an angelic class that fell, or were they hybrids from humans?
It's a very, very good question. So let's say in Greek mythology, where we get the most about the little people, is they tend to be the offspring of the gods again. So whether or not that's true or not, because they're small as compared to the large giants, I think there's more. What you've got going on with the elementals is some crossbreeding between humans and other creatures as well, to sort of bring them down to that sort of size level, right? But we can't ignore that they could be through some sort of sexual copulation, because that's generally how they're described as being created in mythology. Not all of these creatures in mythology were created through a sexual act, at least by the description. Like you have the centaurs that were made in a cloud, for example, which seems to indicate some sort of DNA manipulation. And another interesting thing to factor in, just to cover off some of the bases on how some of these beings might have been created, is when you look at Sumerian history with the Anunnaki, that they were, and let's name one like Gilgamesh or Enkidu, or Upnapishtim, who was the giant Noah from the Epic of the Gilgamesh story. They were described as 2/3 God and 1/3 human. So from an occult perspective, there could be different proportions in terms of how these beings are created through sexual acts that might give you a third possibility, so that you could be a third human, a third from the gods, or a third from another type of being. And so when you start looking at things like Bigfoot and things like that, that starts to maybe answer some of those questions, why you get that not complete chimera effect, but you get that sort of, well, it could be three types of beings in there. But by the time you get into chimera, they've got multiple types of species involved there, which I think has to be DNA manipulation.
What is the third? And does that have to do with this? Can you shed some light on the? I know, you know what? That's a question for a little bit later, because that's going to go into a different subject. But
well, if you're talking about thirds, I think it's got a lot to do with the allegory of the 33rd degree and the third degree, and it's an important sort of number as you put three threes together, right?
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of that. And what I was just going to mention is in Revelation, the number of man is 666, and there seems to be a correlation there, because that's like in decimal wise, isn't that the same thing as a third or something like that? Am I wrong? I suck at math. Tell me.
It'd be 2/3.
2/3. Yeah, there you go. So so I know that.
So 2/3 God and 1/3 human, and if you consider that chapter numbers and verse numbers were arbitrarily put in, and that's why they don't finish a thought or finish a prophecy or whatever. So I'm not sure what the logic was that they tried to organize it better. I get the concept, but Genesis 6:3, which is 3 sixes, right? Is when life was limited to 120 years. So you wonder at those sort of connections between the numbers.
Right, definitely. There's, I mean, especially in the occult, there's a lot of things happening in specific numbers, and that 33 seems to pop up all over the time, always, what I mean? And but going back to the mythology of things, like, so my daughter used to watch fairy cartoons, like the Tinkerbell stuff, and all I knew about Tinkerbell fairies was pretty much. All I knew about fairies was Tinkerbell, pretty much. Like, I didn't really get into fairies, and I heard about other fairies in in anime, there's a lot of fairy stuff. But they released in the last 10 years a series of movies of fairies. And it's funny that you say elementals, because when I hear elementals, in some religions, elementals were in charge of, for example, they were in charge of... kind of like Thor, they were in charge of weather or certain things. They had a specific job, And in the fairy movies that they came out, they really gave them a whole world. And at that time, I was already researching a lot of the stuff that I'm learning now, like your book, Genesis 6, and different things like that. And I started to see this pattern, like these fairies were basically just kind of replacing... it's like a polytheistic version of angels, because in the movies they were releasing, because they had winter fairies, they had spring fairies, they had tinker fairies, they had all these ones, and they all had a specific job, like to either bring in the winter, to bring in spring, and they all had different technologies, and they all had different jobs. And the movies paint them, of course this is a Disney movie, so they paint the polytheistic version of fairies in a very good light, but it seems that fairy mythology in its actual stories is not so pleasant. Am I wrong?
No, it's not. They're not pleasant, and they're not generally looking after the betterment of humankind. They're looking after the Tuatha De Danann, or the giants, which the Tuatha De Danann were, or serving the gods. So when we look at the fairy culture, I described the fourth classification of fairies, which was the lowest one, which included the little people and the salamanders. So there's three other classifications of fairy higher up, which will start to make some sense to people. So you have just above the elementals in the third classification, you have the spirit realm of the fairies. They are like the banshees and all the different sort of descriptions of demons and things. And they're the bodiless spirits of the second order of fairies, which were the offspring of the gods. And so they're the Tuatha De Danann. They become the giants. Their bodies will die because of Genesis 6:3 edict, and their spirits won't die because they're not allowed to go to sleep like humans, and they either have to roam the earth or they're sent to the cells of the abyss. They're not allowed into heaven, and those are like the banshees and all the different kinds of demonic spirit names that you might hear. And the first classification is the flying opalescent beings, and the Tuatha De Danann were shining, but they weren't opalescent. They were spirit beings that came from, in the fairy mythology, from another planet, and they were led by the proud fairy. So now when you start breaking that up, what you basically got here is that angelic order of the fallen that is defined within the fairy culture, and you have the fallen angels who are the opalescent beings and are the gods, and there's a hierarchy of those as well, and they have specific functions. Then you have the demigods that were created to rule over humankind, and then you have the demons that, as you take Diablos back from devil in Revelation 12 and its use in the New Testament, and as it relates to Satan in Revelation 12, the demons all report to the head angel of the fallen ones, Satan, who's the prince of the demons. And demons, or the devil spirits in the New Testament, that goes back to the Greek word daemon, or demon as we get it in English. And they're two different beings than the fallen angels. And so you have a hierarchy of the angels, which you have a significant order. Some of them will look after winds, some of them will look after seasons, but you've got like exousia and dunamis and on as you take those words back in Greek that describe a hierarchy that comes from the host of heaven. And the host of heaven, both the loyal ones and the fallen ones, that's the Hebrew word Saba, which means an army, which has a rank and an order. And so you have a rank and an order in the angelic beings, and then you have a rank and order of the beings that they created in the physical world that still report to them, but are there to enslave and take humankind into destruction.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like, I think if people realize that, just because, I mean, like, I'm a big fan of Lord of the Rings. I like the books and the movies, and, I see why some Christians, like, I see the archetypes in, I guess archetypes are meta, you can really fit a lot of things into archetypes, and it's like, oh, this is really like a biblical narrative. And I mean, me being a Christian, I believe that most stories that are retold, epic stories, are just, in a way, the origin was the biblical narrative, So I see why a lot of Christians would say, like, Lord of the Rings is, like almost Christian in nature, you know what I mean? But then when you like look at the characters, like the dwarfs, and the way you were explaining dwarfs, just from their origin, is literally what Lord of the Rings is painting them to do. They're in the mountains. They actually have different technology. They're very good at certain specific things. And, the more you read, if you're like a nerd when it comes to Lord of the Rings, even like the creation story that they have is almost like the biblical narrative, There's a part, I don't know if you've read that, like, what's the name of that book? It starts with an S. I can never say it. Silmarillion, whatever. It's like the origin story of all of creation in Lord of the Rings. And basically the creator God, or the creator character, is creating everything. And as he's creating everything, he has these beings there along with him, and they're singing with him to create the world that we know. And it's like stealing from the book of Job, where God was creating everything, and then the angels were praising him and singing and things like that, And so,
are you talking about Similarian?
There you go. I can never say it right, And so my point is like, we like these characters, and we tend to glamorize them, and again, it's kind of in my opinion, sometimes a hidden way to glamorize or to attach people, us human beings, to these characters that really their origin story was not a very good one, very demonic, very rebellious against God, in many ways.
Well, and people get caught into believing that Tolkien and Lewis were Christians. They were only Christians on the surface, and so they wrote about their history from in-depth knowledge. They were part of that Inkling Society that we talked about earlier in the show. That's a Rosicrucian society that was at Oxford. That's where they learned their writing.
So you're not a fan of the screw tape letters?
Yeah, you got it. And so there's no way they could be part of that Inkling Society unless they were purebloods, or at least part of a secret society, because they're very, very young, because they're in Oxford. They're just learning. They're being educated, and they're in this writing school. And it's a Rosicrucian organization of the Golden Dawn. And so when you take Lewis's and Tolkien's bloodlines back, you find out that they have bloodlines that go back into royalty, even though that's not well known. And I've got a 6-part series if people want it on Tolkien and Lewis. And in parts 5 and 6, I show you their family bloodlines and how they link back into that. So
really,
and so Tolkien actually, is son of Tolk, for example, and he takes his royalty back through generally Normandy and the taking of Normandy by Rollo, who is going to change their name to the St. Clairs. And so his bloodlines go back to the Norse mythology, which is why you see so much Norse mythology of the fairy people overlaid into the Lord of the Rings as opposed to the Celtic one. And so we need to understand that the only way that they were in the Rosicrucian society is they were purebloods, that they would be initiated into adepthood before they were adult, and that you can't take an adept title until you're somewhere between 25 and 30 years old. So that's why they were there. And all they did was they wrote their history into fairy tale concepts, in terms of it's a very interesting tale, but the true meaning is through the allegories and the characters that are represented in the story, and you need to be an adept to understand all of that. So Lord of the Rings, I mean, you've got, Celtic, you've got Norse, you've got Icelandic things that are encoded throughout the Lord of the Rings, and you also have Sumerian, because when you take the Tuatha De Danann back as coming out of Scythia that we talked about previously, they're also known as the tribe of Anu, so the Tuatha Danu, and the Anunnaki, which is where the Anu is the creator god. They're the head god of the Sumerian pantheon, and so when we look at Midgard as he writes into the story of Middle Earth, that is created from in polytheism from the separation of the chaos, and we understand that coming biblically is a separation of the waters that happens in the day 6 story that created the earth, and that's the original earth that's created before the flood in the polytheist creation mythology. So all of the beings then that are coming forward in the Lord of the Rings are coming through a story of prehistory from whichever antediluvian civilization you want to perhaps place it in, but it comes from the Odin sort of legacy. So let's call it more of a Norse history, which is why Tolkien uses so many Norse fairy mythology into it. They're similar. There's just some different slants onto it, and all of the characters are the beings that were created before the flood by the fallen angels and the humans created by God. And even at the end of the Lord of the Rings, you have this imagery where you got all of these other beings other than humans on a boat sailing away on the water. And that's her allegory for that's the time of man, the time after the flood, and that the separation happens at the time of the flood, and that's the scene that happens at the end of Lord of the Rings.
Right.
And that you get the ring as a symbol of power in the Lord of the Rings. And that actually goes right back into Sumerian mythology as being the ring of power that were held by the gods, and they would award that ring to the ring lords of Nippur. That's where they awarded the kings, and that ring would give them power as their divine representative on earth. And when we look at that ring mythology, I mean, it is absolutely rampant as it comes through the Arthurian tales. And usually with the ring, you also have the sword and some invincible weapons and things like that. And so, like, even the characters of the Arthurian tales, like Merlin, which is like a wizard Gandalf, right? Who is an image or an incarnation of Odin, because Odin looked the same way and wore the same outfits when he took a physical presence on Earth. And so rings and swords were typically the last couple thousand years as the type of weapon. So you have Excalibur, and you have this ring of kings that are sitting around the round table. And so Gawain is representative of the Norse kingdom as the son of the king of Lot in Norway, that's sitting at Arthur's round table as an equal and as a king of Norway. And so all of these stories that are being told have crossover allegories and meanings because they all go back to the same history and belief system and genealogies.
And not without coincidence about all the entities that are against God.
Yeah, exactly.
That's kind of the whole point. Like, I kind of like try to. Go ahead.
And what I like about the King Arthur tale, because it sort of mixes things in, but you've got Arthur, who is son of Uther Pendragon. Dragon is the patriarchal bloodline of the bloodlines, the male bloodlines, and is married to Guinevere, who is a fairy queen of the Tuatha De Danann bloodline of the fairy people, and is the matriarchal bloodline, and both of them are descendants of the Tuatha De Danann.
There you go. And again, the more you know, you just start seeing and to me personally, it makes the stories actually more exciting. You know, obviously I like these movies, and I'm like, what makes it more exciting to me is that even people like myself and like, you know, your everyday person is like, dude, we are part of this larger picture story that God has placed us in. We are surrounded by these Game of Thrones cosmic geographical wars happening, and we are in the midst of it. And in my opinion, me, you, shows like ours that are believers are dispensing this information and making it known to other people. And honestly, it's just waking people up to understand, like, oh, wow, like this war, the powers and principalities, right, that we talk about in Ephesians, this is it. Like, you're in the midst of it, you know? Yeah. Like, you're smack dab in the middle, and the culture is permeated just so deeply into this Nephilim culture, and we are unaware of it. We just kind of go... We just think it's culture. We just think it's entertainment. We just think it's liberal arts. We just think it's politics. We just think it's whatever, you know, the 7 sacred sciences that you talk about in your book, in your first book, and we're unaware of it. But really, these bloodlines have been at it, manipulating for millennia, just trying to, you know, sneak in there and pretty much usurp the job that we were supposed to have in the Garden of Eden before Adam and Eve fell. And
that's the whole sponsor.
Exactly.
And a lot of people say, okay, well then where are the giants in Lord of the Rings? Mm-hmm. You know, how are they sort of allegorized in there? Mm-hmm. And it's a really good question, and it shows you the level of expertise and knowledge and the craft that they had been trained in to write these things. So you have I'm trying to remember some of the characters, but it doesn't really matter. You've got those white elves as one group of people, and they have the pointy Spock-like ears.
Right.
And these are fairy people, right?
Right.
But they're quite a bit
There's
bigger than the
Galadriel.
hobbits
There's
and
a
the dwarves.
Galadriel, the
And they
queen.
say,
There's
well,
Legolas.
who are they?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there are two types of elves in fairy mythology. One is the dark elves, which are part of the ugly ones in one of the classifications. And then you have the white elves, which were much larger, and people don't really sort of dig into that. So now link in the fairy Tuatha De Danann. This is the allegory of those giants, that they were this very white-skinned giants, and they're the people of the Sidhe, S-I-D-H-E. And if you Google writers of the S-I-D-H-E, you're going to get a picture of a very famous painting of the Tuatha De Danann, who are the Sidhe people. And they are riding white horses that have these metal helmets on with a horn to represent a unicorn.
Yes, ma'am.
Just as the Nephilim rode those kinds of creatures before the flood. And these are those white elves, and they're the Tuatha De Danann, and they got all these serpentine types of imagery and other things. It's a really interesting picture, and it's one of the more famous pictures of fairy mythology that was, I think it was painted in the 1800s or something. But that's who they are, because the Tuatha De Danann were the post-Diluvian giants, right? And they take that back to being the giants that were before the flood, who were imprisoned for the rebellion against the gods, but escaped from Tartarus into Scythia after the flood.
Yeah, no, there's so many connections. I think I was asking you before you got on. I was like, if you knew anything about the show The Witcher, because there's a lot of references in the show where it's actually talking about, in my opinion, it could be referencing the book of Joshua, because there's a part where it's, because in the Witcher world, it's a world of hybrid creatures. It's a world of hybrid humans. It's a world of giants. It's a world of warlocks, and and witches and bloodlines. And the thing I found interesting is that there was this coven, or this council of witches, working alongside royal bloodlines, and so their job was to go over there and pretty much be the counsel to all these royal bloodlines to help whatever agenda they had propel forward. And I'm like, ooh, that sounds familiar, and the stuff that there's language, like there's like one-off like little lines in the show where it says, for example, they were abducted at one point by these elves, the pointy-eared, white-colored elves, and and they were mad at the humans because the humans were doing a great purge at one point, and they were getting rid of all of the hybrid creatures. You know what I mean? And anything that wasn't human, that was a creature, they were just eradicating. And I'm like, that's like exactly what Joshua was doing in the you know what I mean? Yep. And I'm just like, these are all references to biblical stories,
Yeah, so as the daughters of Babylon those are the polytheist religions, and that they were part of that organizational structure of ruling all of the empires, because there was only Israel as a monotheist nation that came on board, some 300 and some odd years or more after the flood. So the daughters of Babylon is the mystical religion. And these are the priests and the priestesses that are known in the occult religions as wizards and warlocks for the priests, and also the priestesses were the witches. And so when you understand that witchcraft, if you're going to run a coven of witchcraft, you're going to be an adept. So that's why so many witches are part of Freemasons at the adept level and higher, because they're all part of the same craft, the same organization, just as the craft is another name for Freemasonry or ancient royal masonry. And they were the ones that were developing the knowledge for evil through these mystical religions and the development of the seven sciences, not for good but for evil and against humankind. So it makes sense then that organizational structure was there before the flood, after the flood, and that they communicate with each of these or these different kinds of beings both before and work with these kinds of beings both before and after the flood. I look at it, they either survived the flood or they were recreated again after the flood, and I would fall into the second category, but I do recognize that the polytheists believe that these beings still exist. And as an example of how that starts to play into the end time or into modern technology is in the fairy lore. There are gnomes as one of the categories that I said looked after knowledge and genealogies. They flew highly advanced flying craft, and they come through portals and fairy mounds or fairy shays, because shay can also mean portal as part of the whole fairy understanding of part of being the shay people, and that they would kidnap people for a fortnight in Scottish timing and longer in other cultures, and do sexual experiments on people, and people would return without memories, and they would have to put them in a trance or drug or hypnotize them to figure out what happened to them. And they are described exactly like gray aliens. So if you were to see one, a fairy abduction, you would swear it's a gray alien abduction, because they're using the same type of spaceships and the same types of, they're the same beings. And so I think that type of being and that type of mythos has been with us certainly since the flood, and by polytheist records before the flood, and that they continue to this day. And they're going to be one of the types of beings that are presented to us as part of this greater rebellion in the end time that they're going to ask us to join.
Yeah. Well, quick question. The bad entities seem to have flying saucers or flying technology. Do you think the good ones might have something like that, and we just misunderstood them to have wings and things like that?
You know, that's a very, very good question. Did the descendants of Seth, did they have that type of knowledge as well? My gut feeling is, to a certain degree, they utilized that knowledge as well, not for evil, but for good, until even the Seth line became corrupted, right?
Right. Like, I'm thinking of like the Elijah and Elisha story, and they were surrounded by, good angels. They were surrounded, and they looked, and he asked God to open his eyes, and when he looked around, they were all over the place, and they were on these chariots of fire and things like that. And none of
I see what you're saying. Not from a human or physical, but from an angelic. Yeah, I think they would have had this, and do have the same type of
technology, right?
Technology and stuff even beyond our understanding or ability to imagine, and all things that we're probably going to see. Yeah, I think they had that.
Yeah, for sure.
In the vision, in the vision Ezekiel had, I mean, he sees this chariot being led by cherubim that has wheels within wheels, right? And and it's a vision as opposed to an actual event, but it does represent that heavenly beings do use those type of chariots in this world. At least the fallen angels certainly did, as they described themselves, only using horses or unicorns, as opposed to the cherubim in Ezekiel 1 and Ezekiel 10. But it indicates there are those types of technologies and things that are used in the physical world by the angelic realm, is, I guess, my point on that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I got one more thing to say, and we can land it from there, but is there anything, because let me just finish this statement. Is there anything you can share with us from your upcoming research or upcoming book on Genesis 6 Part 2 that, just give us a morsel, Gary Wade, of something that is in there that we could look forward to?
Yes, I think there's going to be a ton of stuff in there. Some of the things that are kind of interesting would be I'm going to provide the angelic order as I understand it, and provide a lot of sourcing so that people can do that. So you can see the different orders and ranks of the angels, and even as it goes down to the elemental level. And you were talking about hybrids. I'm going to really connect this idea of hybrid humans after the flood that were in existence, and show you how that sort of comes about from the offspring or intermarriage of the Rephaim giants after the flood. And so I'll even start to take those hybrid nations back to an original Rephaim name in a lot of cases. And for reference, so that people know where I'm talking about in terms of who these, why I sort of focus on that just as part of the puzzle of the giants, is that in Numbers 13:33, you have the Anakim that are cited as with the three kings of Sheshai, Talmai, and Ahiman. But you're also told of these people that are taller than the Israelites, but distinct from the Anakim kings that are named. And again, you get the same reference back in Deuteronomy 1 when Moses is recapping that story, that they're taller than the Israelites, but they're not the Anakim. So these are like the hybrid humans. They are taller than Israelites. They are smaller than the Rephaim giants. And the Egyptians called them the Shazu, and I'll give you some other different names. And they were like 6 to 9 feet tall. And the Rephaim were taller, just as Og would have been taller than 10 feet. And where we get some of this is that we do get a patriarch of the Anakim, which is Arba in the book of Joshua. But we don't have Arba show up in the Table of Nations because Rephaim names are not part of the Table of Nations. They are the descendants of the 8 off of the Ark, right? And we have the patriarchy that goes back to the Table of Nations. But there are 9 nations that aren't named that are in the Table of Nations, let alone somebody like a Rapha for Rephaim is not listed for, as another example. And so those are the tribes of Canaan, where Canaan is listed as a patriarch. His son Sidon is listed, and his son Heth is listed. And then you get the families of the Canaanites that include the Amorites that a lot of people think were giants. They weren't fully giants, they were hybrid giants. And I'll talk to people about how that all comes about by the individual 9 families, which goes back to the Hebrew word that actually means not only family, but different kind or different species. And the reason they don't have a patriarch listed is the patriarch was a Rephaim.
Oh, I'm sure people are going to like that. So, hey, Gary, that's all I got for you. Is there anything else that you want to get off your chest before we land this plane?
No, I just would like to suggest to people that if you're wanting to be able to get a better understanding of the type of characters that are written in entertainment today, whether or not it's in the alien phenomena, or it's in the fairy tales, or it's in the vampires, or it's in superheroes, you're going to get those allegories where that comes from in my original book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy. And so you'll be able to better identify that and where it sort of fits in. And even to the point of the elementals, in terms of what I'm talking about, the little people, I cover them off in the Bible, but just as the little people, or in the Bible, in my book, but just as the little people. So I would encourage people that you need to start to understand the language and the allegories of the spurious forces that control the entertainment if you want to understand what they're trying to pass on as messages in preparation for the end times. So you'll get a lot of that in the book. And again, I'll just sort of mention to people if they want to know more about Tolkien and Lewis, I do have a document on each of their genealogies. And if you want to know more about Tolkien and Lewis's writings, I've got a 4-part series that's part of that 6-part series. And just get a hold of me through my website at the Genesis6conspiracy.com with the number 6conspiracy.com, and ask for a topic or those particular ones. And it may take me a little bit of time, but I will send them off to you.
Very good. So one last thing, and just to wrap it up, as a modern day Christian, why should I care about all this information, Gary?
Because I think we're in the fig tree generation, and that if we are, then the great delusion that's coming is going to deceive even the elect, if that were possible, and that's true. So we need to understand how the world is going to be deceived, and even the leaders in the churches are going to be deceived. And that the only way we can better understand what is coming at us on things that we can't imagine is to understand the language of the spurious forces, and then to understand what's actually written in the Bible so that we don't get deceived.
Good. I love that answer for sure. Folks, stick with me, Gary. Stick with me. These people are going to listen to some dope tunes real quick, and me and you will talk off air. Here we go.